The following is a text exchange which occurred between brothers on December 19th, 2021. 9:35 a.m. Wearing giant Elvis necklaces and oversized Elvis and James Dean belt buckles was a rebel subculture in mid-20th century Switzerland. Seems a bit silly, but I still like it.
I have nothing to add to this conversation.
I respect those who take belt buckling to a level of somewhere between anti-broadsword and anti-tank on the armor scale. Never had much use for Elvis, though.
Was Elvis seen as a rebellious person to like in the US when he first started anyway?
Not sure, but the older generation certainly didn't approve of his dancing. Several of the pictures I saw featured albums and skulls and crossbones, and I know James Dean was a thing too, but I saw at least a couple that also used the word Vince. Who was Vince?
Gene Vincent. He sang that Bebop-a-loo-a song. Probably others, but that's the one I remember.
Oh, I know that song, but I don't recall his name at all. Straight from the heartland, this is Things I Text My Brother. Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of Things I Text My Brother, a series of conversations which have taken place between the brothers Drouillard on subjects spanning the neighborhood and the globe, which will hopefully leave you smarter, kinder, and better looking. Today we're going to jump off from that dramatic reading that you just heard and discuss the topics therein. Maybe we'll talk about belt buckles. Maybe we'll talk about Swiss subcultures of the mid-1900s. Maybe we'll talk about rock and roll, Elvis, James Dean, or a mysterious man named Vince. But we haven't plotted an exact course because we want you to join us on that journey. I'm Jeff. This is Brad. Let's talk about our texts. But before we buckle our giant belt buckles and attempt to sort out the delightfully absurdist Swiss subculture described a moment ago, we need to take a look back because it's always important to make time to cleanse ourselves of our past sins and to continue our boundless quest for self-improvement through worthless information. Thus it's time for ablutions and edification. We're on quite a run of being perfect, but that doesn't mean we can't continue to try and edify ourselves and our audience. What bit of edification do you have for us today, Brad?
Well, back in episode 16, Electric Scooters in the Apocalypse.
Oh, I remember that episode. Great episode.
It was a scary episode.
Yeah.
We delved somewhat deeply into the bane of humanity that is e-scooters.
Oh, yeah, we did.
Recently, I have started hearing about geofencing for scooters in different cities, including right here in Central Ohio. Are you familiar with geofencing?
Nope.
Well, for those of you out there who, like you and me, are just learning of this, it is a somewhat effective way to slow or stop scooters as they enter restricted areas of a city or a park or some heavily trafficked area.
Sure.
Basically, as they start to roll into this area that's been geofenced, they are able to use your GPS or RFID or Wi-Fi in order to basically, if the speed limit is 5 miles per hour, they'll slow you down to 5 miles per hour. If no scooters are allowed, it'll just slow you down and make you stop. And then if it's a dead zone where they don't want anything to happen,
they'll chop your head off.
Well, yes. But once you get in there, you can't get your scooter to start back up. And if you leave it there, you get fined.
Seems like a practical solution to me.
It did. But the more I read about geofencing outside of the use in e-scooters, I started reading things about marketing, how they use your location data to pop up ads for you as like you walk past a restaurant or something, which might be useful if you were hungry and you wanted a coupon. But then I started reading about geofence warrants, where law enforcement specifies a location and time period, and with judicial approval of the warrant, they require companies to search their databases for all cell phones and users found in the area at that time. And while I knew it was a thing and have read how it has allowed for innocent people to be arrested incorrectly, and location data has been shown to be incorrect often, and so people have been arrested, they've gone to jail for months, they've lost their loved ones and their significant others, their jobs, their cars, and there's no recourse for them. It's crazy. So that's also part of geofencing. Like everything, it can be good or bad, I guess.
The only part of that I'm really into is the part that says people can be punished for going into a bad area. And I think there should be a guillotine option. If you go maybe more than a few feet or a few meters, just so there's a little bit of a safe zone. But if you would try and take it all the way into a different neighborhood, off with your head.
That seems harsh, but all right.
Well, I certainly feel edified. Are you ready to move on into our next segment?
I am ready to scoot on into Elvis subculture.
Well, now that we're edified, we can take it back to that original text message. I didn't know it at the time, but I was texting you about a group known as the Halbestarken, these rebels from mid-20th century Switzerland. But I don't know where we're going to start this conversation. What do you have in mind?
Well, I was not surprised to find out that you had interest in this subculture. I would have expected you to be more of a cryptozoology or cottagecore fellow.
I have no idea what any of that is.
You know what cryptozoology is.
Cryptozoology would be zoology inside of crypts.
Oh, that would be like the stink ape and the yeti and Bigfoot.
Chupacabra.
Zoologists who study things that are possibly real.
If I run into some pictures of those while randomly surfing the internet someday, I'll probably text you about those. But in this case, I saw people with giant Elvis belt buckles.
Yeah. I assume that you were looking at images from Karlheinz Weinberger.
Karlheinz Weinberger, yes.
Yeah, so when I was researching him, I found out that acclaimed film director John Waters, not to be confused with Elmore's own acclaimed marching band director John Waters, was a fan of Weinberger's art.
He certainly was.
And once I knew that, I could totally see the influences, some of his characters.
Oh, absolutely. I think we probably bumped into the same articles which compared the style of these people who are Halbestarke to that of some of those John Waters characters, like Divine and Ricky Lake and people like that. That's a very easy connection to make once you see the absurdist levels that both those characters and the people in the photographs taken by Karlheinz Weinberger, they do have some outlandish similarities, even though they're not the same style.
They did, especially in like the hair, some of the outfit. I mean, the folks in Switzerland were not as garish necessarily. They were a little more dark tones and chains and ropes and things. But looking at the images I could find online, there were some absolutely insane outfits going on there, which I, of course, also love and would love to recreate someday in my own way.
I vote that we do that. I think we need to recreate this. Maybe even put that on one of our t-shirts that people are going to be buying from our merch store. There's a link to that in the show notes of every episode.
Is it a clickable link or just a text link that you have to copy?
I think it depends on which platform you're listening on.
Well, I don't have much in the way of giant belt buckles. I only really have one belt buckle that isn't the basic belt buckle that comes with your belt. It's a reproduction of that famous Che Guevara image, with his little beret on, that I bought from some mail-order magazine called the Sovietsky Collection.
Of course you did.
I suppose if I was wearing that, I was sort of being similar in my subculture subversions, although I only really did it to annoy people.
I think often that's exactly what subcultures are doing. And you could certainly say that about the Halbestarken rebelling against post-war conservatism that was kind of spreading across the world.
Well, the joke was on me anyway, because almost everybody who ever noticed my belt buckle and asked me who it was, they almost all thought it was Zach De La Rocha from Rage Against the Machine.
Close enough.
I mean, I suppose he was somewhat I don't know if he was a communist, but he certainly was revolutionary in his own way.
I think he could find some common ground with Che Guevara. I really do believe that.
Yeah, so tell me more. I bet you went and looked in this subculture. Tell me more about it.
We certainly don't want to get too much further before our audience has a little bit more of an idea of what exactly Karlheinz Weinberger was taking pictures of. And he's an interesting character and certainly one that we'll want to talk more about. But I found a number of articles which talked about this group. And the photos I had seen were definitely Karlheinz Weinberger's photos. Most of them had appeared in a book that came out in the early 2000s. He passed away in 2006, and most of his images had not been published too long before his death, if at all. These were kind of a pet project for him, but they were high fashion. There were certainly links to the greaser movement that would have been happening over here in the United States. Of course, with the greasers, you had that pomade slick back hair, you had the jeans, maybe just a plain white or black t-shirt, maybe the jeans cuffed above the boots, or later on they would switch to some other shoes. But they were certainly rebelling. They had some similarities to these Halbestarke, but they weren't completely the same. My knowledge of greasers is probably the more cleansed version of it that started to be created by things like American Bandstand and the movie musical Grease. But originally, it was, a little bit harder edge, and it had some racial undertones and things like that as well. The term greaser was going around even in the Civil War times. That was already considered a derogatory term, and the etymology of it is kind of debated, but it certainly came to be associated with people of the lower or working classes, people doing machine work or working as mechanics, and eventually people who had their own hair slicked back. But oftentimes, it was clearly being negative toward the recent immigrants at the time, the Italians, the Greeks, various Hispanic or Latino cultures. The greaser culture was definitely something that we had seen before. But these Halbestarken, which by the way is the German word for half strong or half strength, they were a different entity. They basically took that greaser image and American pop culture in general. And I actually really enjoyed a quote that I saw from a guy who had written in the New York Times. His name was Ken Johnson, and he was referring to an exhibit of Weinberger's work in 2004. And he wrote that they seem at once surreal and ridiculous, like members of a remote cult that heard about American youth culture via shortwave radio. So somebody tells you what Elvis or James Dean is doing, somebody tells you what their life is like, and then you copy a little bit of it, and then you add a whole bunch more to it. Maybe to paint one really good picture, summarize the whole thing, let's go to an article from Vogue.com from Rebecca Bengal in 2017. The article is called Photographer Karlheinz Weinberger's New Book is a Treasure Trove for Rebellious Denim Heads. And just this first paragraph here paints a good picture of everything we're talking about. In 1955, just a couple months after James Dean was killed in a car crash, the release of Rebel Without a Cause made an icon out of its brooding white t-shirt and Lee jeans wearing star. It goes on to talk about Chuck Berry and Bill Haley in the Comets singing Rock Around the Clock, Elvis Presley coming out with songs, Johnny Cash does Folsom Prison Blues, Bo Diddley does Bo Diddley. The term rock and roll had only just been introduced in the vernacular, as the article goes on to say. And meanwhile, in Switzerland, the budding photographer Karlheinz Weinberger clocked in on his first day of a drudge factory manager day job that he'd hold down for decades to come, all while photographing Swiss teenagers, dropouts, and outsiders in his time off, creating not only an indelible portrait of a distinctively style-conscious subculture, but a fascinating fashion document. So people like Vogue magazine are considering this to be almost an avant-garde, but certainly an absurdist take on what was going on with the greasers over here. It got me to thinking Father Art would have been around in the late 50s and 60s. I wonder if he would have been a greaser or taken it up a notch and become a half-strong young man.
It's a fine question. I don't remember him ever dressing like that. He did drive a fancy yellow convertible, but that doesn't necessarily fit into the culture, but it might in the Reggae one, that the greaser version in Sweden.
Yeah, so these people, in terms of what they were wearing and what Father Art probably wasn't wearing, the Halbestarken were, according to the Vogue article, they might have been Switzerland's first true subculture, few in number but creatively deviant. Brad, what were they wearing?
Some of the things that I saw, some of the basic parts, there's probably a step from kind of this subculture, the greaser culture, into punk. So this was kind of that transition where they had some pants that they probably had cut up and they were holding, instead of a zipper, it was held closed by pieces of rope, made holes through and tied in. They had lots of metal buckles and belts and things, chains, extra zippers that they didn't need wrapped around themselves for no apparent reason other than for fashion. It feels like they were on their way kind of to the punk world, but it was kind of that step through. Lots of leather jackets and some denim type jackets and things like that. But the hallmarks being those huge belt buckles with pictures of Elvis Presley and James Dean, which makes no sense.
Yeah, every once in a while you'll see in a movie or something that somebody's in a battle and they get shot and it's just the little metal box in their pocket or something that stops the bullet. You could shoot at them and the surface area that you have to hit is considerably less because of their Elvis and James Dean and Marlon Brando adorned armor that they would be wearing. They, like I said in the original text, they could probably stop a tank if they wanted. It's pretty cool. John Waters, he said that these people have fashion gall. They were trendsetters, which they absolutely were. And I was definitely curious, like, okay, these are working class kids from Switzerland. Granted, it's the late 1950s, 1960s. I didn't know a ton about what would have been going on in Switzerland at the time. Of course, the Halbestarken culture did exist in other European countries, Germanic European populations as well. But in Switzerland, it's interesting that they're rebelling against a movement that they weren't part of, whereas the German Halbestarken, they're rebelling against the extremism that had been around during the war, but also the conservatism that was developing in the post-war era. So you take all of that American greaser culture have them then add their own transistor radio twist to it, and you emerge on the other side with these insane outfits.
And they are absolutely insane outfits, and I love them. So if they were rebelling against what they were rebelling against, what was Danny Zuko rebelling against?
Yeah, maybe foreign exchange students initially, because in Hallmark movie fashion, there was no way that he and Sandy were going to be able to get along at all. But in the end, they ended up happy as can be. Just a couple different things, different articles said. An article from artsy.net from somebody named Alina Cohen. She talked a little bit more about, okay, why Halbestarken? She suggested that their wild outfits tell a larger story about the post-war impact of American culture in Western Europe. The name of the group, which means half-strongs in German, adequately conveys both the young subject's rough demeanor and ultimate harmlessness. And I like that she pointed that out because, I mean, not that you can think of John Travolta in Grease or Lenny and Squiggy as being these really frightening characters. Fonzie has actually got a pretty hard edge compared to any of them. But you do think of these people acting tough and probably still being pretty harmless. And I did like that. When you go look at these pictures, and they're very easy to find if you Google Elvis, Swiss subculture, anything like that, or the Halbestarken, you'll get these images, and you'll probably get Karlheinz's images. Some of these kids are 19 years old. Some of these kids look like they're 15 years old. Maybe they are. And they're wearing these ridiculous outfits that try and offer a perceived toughness when, in fact, you can't really take these kids. I mean, most of them are just kids, even if they're adults. It's hard to really take them seriously. And so the Halbestarken, as we mentioned, emerged after World War II, and incorporating the iconography of rock and roll and Hollywood into their rebellion. They sought to defy the political establishment and the conformity that led to nationalist fervor and devastating worldwide conflict. This made plenty of sense in Germany, but the Swiss protesters had an ironic edge. Their country didn't participate in either war, which I thought that was kind of a fun point.
Yes, for sure.
They were rebels like the American greasers, but they were kind of rebels on steroids. Maybe not literally steroids. They were probably more literally rebels on motorbikes. But it's definitely an absurd culture. And I don't really know anything about Elvis or James Dean or Marlon Brando more than what the average person knows. But I certainly have never thought, before discovering the Halbestarken, about taking an iconic image of one of my favorites, like Slim Goodbody, and slapping it on a circle the size of a frying pan and then wearing it with a chain around my neck. But I'm very likely to start doing that.
Feels like something that you should do, for sure. You should absolutely go there.
Did you read any more about Karlheinz Weinberger himself?
I only a little bit, in that his fame pretty much escaped him until he was quite old.
Yeah, he was a factory worker, and then he would go home. And it was interesting. He took this camera and used it as a tool to both get into these cultures that he was interested in, but I think the camera also gave him distance from those cultures. I saw somebody describe him as the constant observer. Some of his earliest photographs were taken for a magazine which was connected with a gay underground nightclub. His images aren't overly sexualized. They do seem to capture some kind of innocence about them. And they're certainly a loving tribute to his subjects without ever imposing himself into the setting directly. But yeah, most of his photographs were his own private collection, and they only really reached the galleries and became international after his death. And within the past couple of decades, they've definitely gone out and become pretty well known. And he made this second life out of capturing this group of youth that he called the Unusuals. And I'm so glad that I bumped into these pictures of these people, because I think all of it needs to come back.
I did see where John Waters said he kept his prints just loose leaf laying under his bed. So when he went to buy some from him, he got them from underneath Karlheinz's bed. So you said it was their first subculture, but what about Dadaism in Switzerland?
No, I don't. Well, the article, the Vogue article.
Oh, the Vogue article said it.
Once you start delving into what counts as a subculture, where they happened, is it just style? Is it music? Is it just an attitude? Defining the term of subculture itself becomes very difficult, and I certainly can't pretend to be any expert on what those subcultures are.
Since this is already taken, if you were to start a subculture movement, what movement would you start?
Several of the pairs of flip-flops I've had in recent years, the sole of the flip-flop, although it originally seemed like it was part of the inch-thick flip-flop itself, the very bottom edge of it, maybe an eighth of the size of the sole itself, has fallen off at some point. Then you have a very soft flip-flop which still looks to the outside world like it is a flip-flop, but it gives you less protection against rocks and other things. If I was going to start a movement, maybe it would be a movement that intentionally ripped off just that very soul of the flip-flop so that myself and the others were doing it, we would know that we could feel the rocks through our flip-flops and nobody else would.
Sort of an invisible walking on coals kind of thing.
Yeah, because I'm not here to draw attention to myself. I wouldn't dare.
Well, there you go.
But speaking of these Halbestarke, what did we say that Halbestarke means, Brad?
I don't remember.
It means half strong.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it seems like it could be making fun of them, saying, these are just little kids. They're not even fully strong yet. They're half strong, although the culture did embrace it.
If Halbestarke is half strong, what is half paying attention? Because what's the word for that? Because I think that must have been what I was doing when you gave me the definition before.
I don't know, but it's an interesting question that you ask about what the half whatevers are, because it just so happens that I have a German Hab words quiz for you.
Oh, no. Habsburgs? Were the Habsburgs half of people?
So I don't know. These are, I guess this is probably a Halb word quiz. I couldn't find a German word for quiz, but I did translate the sentence for, this is a half-word exam. So, dies ist eine halbes Prüfung. Okay, are you ready for this eine halbe Prüfung?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a series of questions that are half something in the German language, and you have to try and tell me what they are. For this, I am going to bring in a very good friend of mine who has better German pronunciation than I do. His name is Google Translate, and he may or may not be correct. Your first German Halbword, tell me what this word is.
Halbblind. Halbblind.
Half blind?
Yeah, it's very similar. I'll give you a clue. It is very similar. It's not blind, but it's very similar.
Oh, half blind.
Half blind. Ding, 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 ding. 1 for 1. So maybe I'll give you halbe point for that one since I had to help you.
I'll take halbe point. I'll take it and run with it.
All right. I kind of feel like you put a half-hearted effort into that one, but we'll just move on and we'll give you a new word. Here we go.
Halbherzig. Halbherzig.
Halbherzig.
Half-hearted.
Half-hearted. You're very good.
I saw where you were going. I picked that up. I picked up on it.
Yeah, I tried to be sneaky and slip that by you without you knowing.
Oh, no, I had it.
I don't know if this one is easy or hard, but I like this one. Here you go.
Halbinsel. Halbinsel.
Halbinsel.
Half inside.
Close.
Half outside. It's like a Venn diagram.
Close. Think of Insel as an island, but what would a half island be?
Something that is currently sinking.
It's a peninsula.
Well, that's not a half island.
No, that would be like, what?
Because it could be covered on 3 sides,
of
right, yeah.
We're going to move on. I think you're ready for a more difficult one. There's no reason you would ever get this one.
Halbimmergrün. Halbimmergrün.
Half immergrün. Imagine half Mowgli.
It's semi-deciduous, obviously. How can you not know the German word for semi-deciduous?
Sometimes I hate you.
I hate me all the time. All right, let's do one more. If you get this one, I will restore all your points from half points to full points.
All right.
Here it is.
Halbautomatisch. Halbautomatisch.
Half automated.
So take that one step further. Kind of remember our last word about the something deciduous.
Half insidious?
Halbautomatisch.
I got nothing.
Halbautomatisch.
Semi-automatic.
Oh, that had nothing to do with
Well,
deciduous.
because
You threw me
instead
off.
of the deciduous one was also semi-deciduous and not half deciduous. So I was hoping you would pick up on automatisch and then make it semi-automatisch instead of half automatic.
Halbautomatisch.
Oh, I see that now. I did look up some information about how rebellious or the level of rebelliousness of Elvis, because I did ask that question. Of course, I knew that his dancing, where he put the empty toilet paper roll on a string in his pants to make it shake more, was a thing.
I knew nothing about that. I knew that he learned how to dance while staying at Forrest Gump's house, but I didn't know any other part.
All right. Forrest Gump makes an appearance. Yeah. So aside from that, I didn't find much, but I did read an article written in 2007 in the Socialist Worker.
Brad, if you had been alive during the early years of the Greasers when we were looking for communists, what are the chances you would not have been kicked out of Hollywood?
Well, I mean, I probably would have read the communist literature because I've always been intrigued by these large movements and trying to understand them.
Yeah.
But I certainly am not a communist.
It's exactly what a communist would have said.
Right, exactly. And I do own some red clothing, so... I was reading this article in Socialist Worker.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the premise of the article is that Elvis was not a rebel because of his dancing, but because he was fighting against the strictures of capitalism, but he didn't know he was. And he was a victim of the greed of his capitalist manager, Colonel Parker, who gave him nothing in return. So Elvis was fighting constantly against capitalism. He just didn't know it.
Yeah, I'm sure that he wasn't cashing any of those checks. He was Secret Comrade Elvis, apparently.
They didn't make a very compelling argument, but I liked that they tried all the same. Tell me, Brother Jeff, do you know where the largest belt buckle in the world is?
No, but I have a feeling that I'm about to find out.
It's in Uranus, Missouri.
Uranus, Missouri?
Uranus, Missouri. It's 10 feet by 13 feet. It's a belt buckle with a Route 66 logo on it, and it is on Route 66.
And a belt buckle that size fits in Uranus?
Apparently so. It is found behind the Funkyard Palace.
Oh, where else would you put it?
It gets better. Remember, we're in Uranus.
Yeah, we are.
It's found behind the Funkyard Palace, not far from the Uranus Fudge Factory. The best fudge comes from Uranus. And right next to the Fudge Factory is a mini golf course called Putt Pirates. They're really playing up the alien probing thing with that one.
They definitely are.
I will say this is a rabbit hole I decided not to go any further. For what it's worth, though, the giant belt buckle is a free roadside attraction. So if you're traveling through Uranus, Missouri on Route 66, you can see the giant belt buckle and get your picture taken, and it doesn't cost you a dime.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I found all that stuff out somewhat by accident. I wasn't actually looking for what the largest belt buckle in the world was. It just kind of popped up into my Google newsfeed, stories I might like after I had done some research on giant belt buckles.
Well, that makes sense. When I was looking into a little bit more about clothing, and specifically when I was looking up the Greasers, well, our Halbestarken would have been wearing quite often cowboy boots. The Greasers would have started out with boots, but they shifted to their Converse Chucks or these thick-soled creeper shoes. But they also started wearing this type of shoe called the Winklepicker. Have you ever heard of the Winklepicker?
Is it related to the penny loafer?
I don't believe it is. Immediately when I saw the word Winklepicker, I was done thinking about James Dean belt buckles, and I was ready to move on to what in the world are these shoes called Winklepickers? The Winklepicker actually refers to these periwinkle snails, which I don't even know what the periwinkle part means, but they're these edible snails. It says you might eat these snails as a seaside snack. And you might not, because who wants to sit around eating snails pulled right from the sea? But anyway, you need to have a little scooper or a little pointy thing to pick out the snail from their shells. And so since you would be eating winkles from outside these shells, when people started having really pointy boots in England, they started calling them Winklepickers because you could use the shoes in theory to pick out the snails. I've heard that other countries had different names for them. Some people said that in the United States they're even called roach stompers, which I don't know why you would need a really pointy shoe to stomp a roach.
Maybe if it's in the corner?
Oh, maybe, because I would think you just want, more surface area if you're going to stomp. But if you want to launch a precise directed assault on the cockroach, sure.
I mean, it helps you get in the corners, and you can also, besides killing roaches, you can kill TB, right?
Yes, you can, because the TV is going to be in the corner. If you don't know what we're talking about, go back to episode 30, in which we talked about consumptive vampire cocktails and choreomania, and you'll find that cancer and tuberculosis used to live in corners. But don't let us spoil the rest for you. Anyway, speaking of these Winklepickers, that's where my exploration started when I heard that some of the greasers started wearing these. But that led me to something that I got the most excited about, which were the shoes known as Krakows. Brad, what do you know of the word Krakow?
It's a city in Poland.
It's a city in Poland, and that's where these shoes were allegedly inspired by or brought to life around Krakow in maybe the 13th, 14th, 15th century. They're also known as pulanes or pikes in various cultures. Pulane is another word that refers to its Polish connection. But These are extremely long, pointy-nosed shoes, and I'm talking really extreme. So there was a monk who described a pair that he saw a woman of the court wearing in 1394. He said that the points on these shoes were half a yard in length, and the people had to tie the tips of their points to their shin with chains of silver. So you've got this boot that has a point that is maybe a half a yard long, and so that it doesn't just like flop around or break off, you actually had to then tie the point of your shoe to your shin to keep it in place. Sounds very practical, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what, 1.5 feet? Is that why jesters had those shoes?
Yeah, when you see pictures of them, you'll start to see those exaggerated points on things. And yeah, those court gestures and things in old paintings will certainly bring that into a little bit of a focus.
Yeah.
It seems like the wealthier the people were, the more likely they were to be wearing these. So much so, in 1368, Charles V of France issued a rule just basically declaring that they couldn't be made and they couldn't be worn in Paris. By the 1460s, Edward IV passed a similar law saying that only the highest of the high-ranking people in society could wear these pointy Krakow-type shoes. At some point, later on, he actually made it so that nobody in England could wear shoes that had spikes longer than 2 feet long. But apparently it had gotten very ridiculous in that there were people who wore such long shoes that other people complained there was no way they could actually get down to pray while wearing these shoes. There were also people who, remember, it's the rich people wearing these, and the rich people are going into battle on their horses. They're wearing these big pointy shoes on their horses, but if they have to dismount and go into combat, they actually had to break off the tips of their shoes so that they wouldn't get killed for looking fancy.
Why didn't they just wear a different pair of shoes into battle? That doesn't make any sense to me. Surely these rich people had 2 pairs of shoes.
Yeah, I think if you're going to wear Winklepickers or these Krakow shoes into an equestrian battle, you might also want to take a few hints from the Halbestarke and wear giant metal plates with your favorite 14th century king or queen on them, just for a little bit of extra safety.
Yeah.
Well, there's one man who will never need to resort to wearing belt buckles which border on battle armor or shoes that double as snail scoopers in order to properly stand out. He's our Father Art, and we're going to ask him some questions.
During the mid-20th century, a small group of young, self-proclaimed Swiss rebels started a subculture which took altered denim, comically oversized belt buckles bordering on armor, and images of icons such as Elvis Presley and James Dean, and turned them into absurdist fashion in the face of post-war conservatism. If you had chosen to turn a 1960s icon into a fashion statement during your teenage years, who would you have chosen?
Probably Bob Dylan. Although he was a lightweight physically, he certainly represented his times.
That's true, and those times were changing. If ridiculous, oversized belt buckles were not an option, what type of unusual accessory or clothing might you have chosen or created to display this icon?
Oh, it probably would have been a hat of some sort, maybe a Tyrolean hat with a feather in it.
Are you able to get hats big enough for your giant head?
Once in a while.
Yeah. I mean, it's full of brains, so it's got to be big.
That's true.
If Elvis, James Dean, and you, assume everyone is in their prime, were to compete in a fashion show, who would win?
Well, certainly Elvis. I think he had it, and his duckbill particularly would make him the winner, just to accent his clothes.
Another name for this group was the Halbestarke, which translates to half strong. If you and your friends during your late teenage years or early 20s were to be labeled as half something, what would that something have been?
Oh, I was going to say maybe I was quarter strong.
Quarter strong.
But I don't know. I did have a friend that went into a pizza place one time and asked the guy how big their 9-inch pizza was. and there was a picture of it on the wall.
So half smart would have been your friend group.
Well, yeah, at least that one.
Well, folks, now that we've heard from Father Art, it means that our time together is coming to an end for this episode. We've said just about everything we're prepared to say about Uranus, Che Guevara, die Halbestarke, Karlheinz Weinberger, cryptozoology, pomade, and Winklepickers. But fear not, just as soon as we can dig back into the archives and find another gem of a text exchange, there will be another episode coming your way. In the meantime, you can head over to our Instagram page at Things I Text My Brother Podcast to drop us a note about what you liked, what you didn't like, or to tell us about something we got totally wrong. You might even have time to go tell a friend, an enemy, and a total stranger to give us a listen as well. If you manage to do any of that, the fraternity of Drouillards will be forever grateful. And if you manage to go to our merch shop, which is linked in the show notes, we'll be even more grateful. But most importantly, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Whatever. But at the time, there was a soap opera on TV in Mexico when I was there, where there was a character whose job was going to plazas and electrocuting people with batteries.
Well, kids, if you're out there listening, don't let anybody tell you you can't be anything you want in life. All right, here we go. Yeah.
Well, I don't want fop. I'm a Dapper Dan man.